Have you ever felt sadness wrap around you like a persistent shadow, stealing your peace and joy? Saint Teresa of Ávila, doctor of the Church and a teacher of spiritual life, knew the depths of melancholy firsthand and discovered the sure path to true joy, a joy that springs from an encounter with God. This extraordinary woman of the 16th century not only conquered her own battles against affliction, but left us a treasure of practical wisdom to transform our sorrows into stepping stones to holiness. In these stories, you'll discover how St. Teresa, with her down-to-earth practical wisdom and her passionate love for Christ, can guide you from the darkness of melancholy to the radiant light of inner peace that only God can give. Chapter 1. The Melancholy Young Woman. Teresa of Ahumada and Cepeda was born in Avila on March 28, 1515, into a large and deeply Christian family. From her childhood, she showed a lively and passionate temperament, but also a marked sensitivity that made her vulnerable to changing moods. The loss of her mother when she was barely 13 years old left a deep wound in her heart, an emptiness that she would try to fill in various ways during her youth. That little girl who read the lives of saints and dreamed of martyrdom began to experience the first shadows of the sadness that would accompany her for years. In her adolescence, Teresa was drawn to the vanities of the world, worldly conversations, and the desire to please. This inner division between her spiritual aspirations and the temptations of secular life generated a painful conflict in her soul. The young woman found herself divided between two loves: the love of God that she had known in her childhood and the passing satisfactions that the world offered. This internal tearing produced in her a constant restlessness, a dissatisfaction that no amusement or human companionship could calm. Sadness began to nest in her heart as a consequence of this divided life. Her father, Mr. Alonso Sanchez de Cepeda, worried about the change in his daughter's behavior, decided to send her as a boarder to the convent of the Augustinian nuns of Our Lady of Grace. There, away from worldly distractions, Teresa began to regain some inner peace. The orderly life of the convent, the communal prayer, and the contact with fervent nuns acted as a balm for her troubled soul. However, a serious illness forced her to return home, and with it returned doubts about her vocation and the future of her life. During her convalescence in the house of her uncle, Mr. Pedro, Teresa discovered a book that would change the course of her existence, the Letters of St. Jerome. Those pages rekindled in her heart the desire to give herself completely to God. The reading convinced her that religious life was the sure path for her soul, although fear and uncertainty still tormented her. She then understood a fundamental truth. The sadness she experienced did not come from God, but from her resistance to fully follow the divine call that resonated in the depths of her being. At the age of 20, Teresa made the decision that would mark her destiny: to enter the convent of the Incarnation of the Carmelites in Avila. However, this determination did not come without a struggle. She had to overcome the opposition of her father and her own fears. The night she left her father's house to enter the convent, she experienced a pain so intense that she compared it to the agony of death. But in the midst of that suffering, she discovered something extraordinary. When everything is given to God, even the most acute pain can become the threshold of an inexplicable peace. This was Teresa's first great step on her path to true joy. Chapter 2. Awakening in the Convent. Teresa's first years in the Convent of the Incarnation were not the spiritual paradise that some might imagine. On the contrary, they were times of inner struggle, of spiritual lukewarmness, and of a subtle but persistent sadness. The convent, which housed more than 100 nuns, functioned with a mitigated rule that allowed numerous visits, conversations in the parlor, and certain worldly comforts. This atmosphere of spiritual relaxation did not help a soul like Teresa's, who longed for total surrender. but found herself divided between the love of God and human affections. For almost 20 years, Teresa lived in a state that she herself would describe as a double life. She practiced prayer, fulfilled her religious duties, and maintained an outwardly correct life. But her heart was not completely surrendered to God. This spiritual mediocrity robbed her of true joy, leaving her in a state of chronic dissatisfaction. She would later recognize that she tried to please God without displeasing the world, seeking to enjoy divine consolations without renouncing disordered affections. This duplicity plunged her into a deep sadness, because the human soul cannot find true peace when it is divided. Teresa's health suffered severely during these years. She suffered mysterious illnesses that doctors could not diagnose, intense pain, partial paralysis, and various ailments that brought her to the brink of death. Some spiritual interpreters have seen in these diseases a physical manifestation of her inner conflict. Teresa's body seemed to reflect the illness of her soul, the lack of total decision for God. The saint herself would later relate her physical ailments to her spiritual lukewarmness, understanding that when the soul is not at peace, the body also suffers the consequences. During this period of lukewarmness, Teresa almost completely abandoned the practice of mental prayer. The reasons she gave were many: lack of time, various worries, her illnesses, and above all, a false humility that made her think that she was not worthy of treating so intimately with God. However, the real motive was deeper. Prayer confronted her with herself, with her inconsistencies, and with the divine call that she did not want to fully attend to. By turning away from prayer, she turned away from the source of true joy, and sadness settled more and more in her heart as a permanent guest. Despite everything, divine mercy never abandoned Teresa. God allowed her to experience flashes of His presence that kept alive in her the longing for something greater. These moments of grace were like loving calls from the divine spouse who was looking for his lost bride. Teresa lived in a painful contradiction. She could not be happy either with God or without Him. This unbearable tension was actually the preparation for her great conversion. Sometimes, God allows the soul to experience the sadness of a lukewarm life, precisely so that it may yearn more intensely for the joy of total surrender. Chapter 3. The Conversion of the Heart. The year 1554 marked a decisive turning point in the life of Saint Teresa. She was 39 years old and living mired in that spiritual mediocrity that kept her in constant dissatisfaction. One day, entering the chapel, her eyes fell upon a very scarred image of Christ that had been brought for the festivities. The representation of the Lord in His passion impacted her in such a way that she felt as if her heart would break. She fell to her knees before that image and burst into inconsolable tears. In that moment of grace, Teresa understood how much Christ had loved and how little she had responded to that infinite love. That experience before the scarred Christ unleashed a profound conversion in Saint Teresa. For the first time in many years, she felt an authentic sorrow for her lukewarmness and a burning desire to change her life radically. The sadness that had been sterile and paralyzing was transformed into a fruitful pain that drove her toward God. She then discovered a fundamental truth. There exists a sadness, according to God, that leads to conversion and to life, different from the sadness of the world that leads to spiritual death. The pain of having offended the divine beloved became the engine of her inner transformation. Along with this visual experience, Teresa found a book that God placed in her hands at the precise moment, the Confessions of Saint Augustine. Reading the story of the conversion of the saint from Hippo, she recognized her own story as in a mirror. The tears of Augustine in the Garden of Milan resonated with hers before the scarred Christ. Saint Augustine's description of his divided life, his inner struggles, and finally his total surrender to divine grace illuminated the path that Teresa was to follow. She understood that she was not alone in her struggle, and that God's mercy was sufficient to transform even the most hardened sinner. From this conversion onward, Teresa resumed the daily practice of mental prayer, with a determination that would never falter again. She understood that prayer was not a spiritual luxury, nor an exercise for perfect souls, but the necessary medicine to heal the heart sick with sadness. In prayer, she found the space where God could speak to her directly, console her, guide her, and transform her. She no longer fled from the intimate encounter with the Lord, but sought Him as the thirsty seeks water. This decision to persevere in prayer, especially in moments of dryness, was the key that opened the doors of true joy in her life. Teresa's conversion was not a one-day event, but the beginning of a continuous process of deepening in divine love. However, that moment, before the scarred Christ and the reading of St. Augustine, marked the point of no return. Teresa had gone from being a lukewarm nun to becoming someone deeply in love with Christ. Her heart, which had been divided and therefore sad, began to unify around a single love, a single desire to please God in everything. And with this inner unification came a peace that no external circumstance could ever take from her. She had discovered that true joy does not depend on the situations in life, but on the intimacy with He who is the source of all joy. Chapter 4. Prayer, Medicine of the Soul. After her conversion, Saint Teresa became an unsurpassed teacher of the life of prayer. Her personal experience of having lived years without praying, and then having discovered in prayer the remedy for her sadness, uniquely qualified her to teach others this path. Teresa understood that mental prayer is not a practice reserved for a privileged few, but the ordinary means that God has provided to heal souls and fill them with His joy. In her writings, especially in The Way of Perfection and The Interior Castle, she left a treasure of practical teachings on how to pray and how to overcome the obstacles that hinder prayer. For St. Teresa, mental prayer is simply an intimate sharing between friends, taking time frequently to be alone with Him who we know loves us. This simple but profound definition reveals the heart of her teaching. Prayer is not a complicated exercise of spiritual techniques, but a personal encounter with Christ, the faithful friend who never abandons us. The saint insisted that it is not necessary to know much to pray, but to love much. The soul that approaches prayer with simplicity and a sincere desire to be with God will find in that encounter the medicine for all its sadnesses. The loving presence of the Lord dispels the darkness of the soul, as the sun dispels the morning mists. Saint Teresa clearly identified the obstacles that impede prayer and thereby keep the soul in sadness. The first is the lack of determination, starting prayer without a firm purpose of persevering, no matter what. The second is discouragement in the face of dryness and distractions, believing that if consolation is not felt, prayer is useless. The third is self-love and attachments to human comforts that prevent total surrender to God. Teresa taught that overcoming these obstacles requires humility to recognize our poverty, confidence in divine mercy, and unwavering perseverance. Whoever perseveres in prayer despite the difficulties will discover that God never fails to respond to the soul that seeks Him sincerely. Saint Teresa masterfully described the stages of the path of prayer, using the image of 4 ways to water a garden. The first is drawing water from the well with a bucket, representing the prayer of beginners, which requires much personal effort. The second is using a water wheel with buckets, where there is less work, but human effort is still required. The third is watering with water from a river or stream, where human intervention is minimal. The fourth is when it rains abundantly from the sky, representing the highest degrees of prayer, where God waters the soul directly, without work on our part. This teaching is fundamental to understanding that the life of prayer has a progressive development, and that spiritual joy grows as the soul advances in intimacy with God. The most consoling thing about St. Teresa's teaching on prayer is her insistence on divine mercy. Teresa, who knew from her own experience the misery of the lukewarm and sinful soul, never ceased to proclaim that no one is too sinful to begin to pray. On the contrary, it is precisely the sickest souls who most need this medicine. The saint encouraged everyone, without exception, to persevere in prayer, even when it seems that no fruit is obtained. God, St. Teresa said, doesn't look at the quality of our words, but the sincerity of our desire. An unwavering soul seeking God in prayer, even amidst dryness and distractions, will never be abandoned, and little by little, almost without noticing, that soul will see the sadness oppressing it, replaced by a peace and joy that doesn't depend on external circumstances. Chapter 5. The Demon of Melancholy. St. Teresa was a woman of extraordinary spiritual insight, who learned to discern the different origins of the soul's inner movements. Her personal experience and her gift for discerning spirits allowed her to identify with clarity when sadness comes from natural causes, when it's permitted by God for purifying purposes, and when it is directly a diabolical temptation. This ability to discern is essential for anyone wishing to overcome sadness and achieve true joy. Saint Teresa taught that the demon uses affliction as one of its most effective weapons to turn souls away from God and prayer. The enemy of the human soul knows perfectly well that a sad heart can hardly rise to God with fervor. Therefore, according to St. Teresa, the demon works tirelessly to sow discouragement, melancholy, and a kind of spiritual heaviness in the soul that makes any effort toward holiness seem impossible. This diabolical sadness has its own characteristics. It comes accompanied by confusion, unease, bitterness, and a feeling of abandonment by God. It is a barren sadness that leads not to conversion, but to despair. St. Teresa warned her spiritual daughters that when they experience this type of affliction, they should immediately recognize its origin and reject it with energy. One of the enemy's most subtle strategies, according to St. Teresa's teaching, is to use a false humility to plunge the soul into sadness. It makes the person focus excessively on their sins and miseries, not to lead them to genuine repentance and trust in divine mercy, but to sink them into discouragement and the feeling that it's useless to try to draw near to God. St. Teresa called this restless humility and clearly distinguished it from true humility, which, although it recognizes its own misery, always trusts in the infinite goodness of God. False humility paralyzes. True humility liberates and gives peace. St. Teresa also identified another tactic of the demon: to make the soul grieve excessively over small faults, or even over things that are not sin. The enemy amplifies any imperfection in the imagination until it becomes an insurmountable mountain, thus robbing the soul of its peace. The saint taught that in the face of these disproportionate afflictions, the correct response is confident abandonment in divine mercy, and to continue forward without stopping to dwell on one's own miseries. God, St. Teresa said, is not waiting for us to be perfect to love us, but loves us in our imperfection and works patiently in our transformation. This truth, when deeply understood, completely disarms the enemy's strategy. St. Teresa left very specific instructions for combating sadness of diabolical origin. First, the soul must recognize where this affliction comes from and not accept it as if it came from God. Second, it must actively resist it. Through acts of faith, hope, and charity, remembering the divine promises and the infinite goodness of the Lord. Third, it must continue faithfully with its exercises of prayer and devotion, even if it seems to do them without any feeling. Fourth, it must seek honest joy through holy activities that lift the spirits, because the saint knew that body and soul are united, and what affects one affects the other. Saint Teresa herself practiced joy as a virtue, even saying that famous phrase, "A sad saint is a sad saint." With this practical and realistic teaching, Saint Teresa shows us that the fight against diabolical sadness is not only possible, but necessary, and that the weapons to overcome it are within reach of every soul who desires to serve God with joy. Chapter 6. The Mansions of Inner Joy. In 1577, Saint Teresa wrote her spiritual masterpiece, The Interior Castle, where she describes the soul as a diamond castle with 7 concentric mansions, in whose center God himself dwells. This work is not just an abstract mystical treatise, but a practical map of the path to union with God, and therefore to true and lasting joy. Saint Teresa teaches that every soul has this magnificent palace within, but that many live in the outer rooms of the castle, without daring to enter the inner mansions, where the true treasure is found. The sadness of so many people comes precisely from seeking happiness outside the castle, in the outer courtyard, when true joy awaits them inside. The first mansions represent the state of souls who have just begun the spiritual life. These souls are still very attached to the things of the world and to their own interests. Although they seek God, they still do so with many reservations. Saint Teresa explains that in these mansions, joy is intermittent, because the heart is divided. There are moments of fervor, followed by periods of lukewarmness and sadness. The soul in the first mansions is like a person who has one foot inside the castle and another outside, trying to please 2 masters. Saint Teresa encourages these souls not to be discouraged by their imperfections, but to persevere in prayer and in the practice of the virtues, trusting that God will gradually lead them to deeper mansions. In the 4th and 5th mansions, the soul experiences what Saint Teresa calls prayer of quiet and prayer of union. Here, God begins to work more directly in the soul, granting experiences of his presence that bring with them a peace and joy, impossible to explain with human words. However, Saint Teresa warns that along with these spiritual consolations, God also sends trials and purifications that can cause great suffering. The saint teaches that even in the midst of pain, the soul that has tasted divine sweetness keeps an unalterable peace deep within. This is the paradox of the spiritual life. One can have inner joy, even when external circumstances are painful. The 6th and 7th mansions represent the highest degrees of the mystical life, spiritual betrothal and spiritual marriage. In these mansions, the soul lives in a habitual union with God that completely transforms its way of life. Saint Teresa describes that in spiritual marriage, the soul reaches such a deep peace that nothing can truly disturb it. It doesn't mean that external trials or physical pains vanish, but the center of your soul remains in constant calm and joy. Saint Teresa herself lived in this state during her final years, and those who knew her testified that even amidst great physical suffering and contradictions, her spirit remained joyful, and her demeanor was kind and cheerful. The fundamental teaching of the interior castle for anyone seeking to overcome melancholy is this: true joy isn't found in external circumstances, but in the intimacy with God that dwells in the center of your soul. As long as we seek happiness outside ourselves, in possessions, pleasures, honors, or even in human affections, we'll remain in the outer rooms of the castle, where unrest reigns. But if we have the courage to begin the inner journey, to traverse the mansions through prayer and self-denial, we'll finally reach that center where God awaits us with open arms. There, In the seventh mansion, we'll discover that we've been searching in 1,000 wrong places for what was always waiting for us in our own heart, the presence of infinite love, which is the source of all true and lasting joy. Chapter 7. The Reform and Fruitful Suffering. In 1562, at the age of 47, St. Teresa founded the first convent of the Carmelite Reform, the monastery of St. Joseph in Ávila. This seemingly simple undertaking was actually the beginning of a spiritual battle of epic proportions that would last until the end of her life. Teresa's idea was to return to the primitive fervor of the Carmelite rule, establishing small convents where the nuns lived in absolute poverty, silence, strict enclosure, and were totally dedicated to contemplative prayer. However, this prophetic vision met with fierce opposition from multiple fronts. The founding of St. Joseph caused a scandal in the city of Ávila, being attacked from the pulpits and in public conversations. Teresa faced incomprehension, slander, and persecution, even from religious authorities. During the next 20 years, Saint Teresa would found 17 convents of discalced nuns, traversing Spain in difficult journeys despite her failing health. Each foundation was an adventure of faith, often starting without economic resources, facing extreme climates, dangerous roads, and both civil and religious opposition. Teresa traveled in uncomfortable carts, under the stifling heat of the Castilian summer or the piercing cold of winter, suffering constant physical pain. On many occasions, she arrived at places where the houses obtained for the convents were in ruins, without roofs or doors, having to start literally from scratch. Any normal person would have succumbed to discouragement in the face of such adversities. What was extraordinary about St. Teresa during this period isn't that she didn't suffer, but the way she transformed suffering into a source of joy. She herself wrote about her founding journeys with delightful humor, recounting the adventures, setbacks, and even the comical moments that arose in the midst of difficulties. When her cart overturned and fell into a stream, Teresa told the Lord that she wasn't surprised he had so few friends if he treated the ones he had that way. This ability to maintain a good sense of humor even in the worst circumstances reveals her secret. She had learned to unite her sufferings to the cross of Christ, thus transforming them into offerings of love. Suffering that has no meaning produces sadness and bitterness, but suffering offered for love becomes joy. St. Teresa also faced terrible internal trials during the years of the Reform. She suffered the incomprehension of her confessors, some of whom even said that her mystical experiences came from the devil. She experienced dark nights of the soul, where it seemed that God himself had abandoned her. She lived the anguish of seeing her work on the verge of destruction when religious authorities tried to suppress the Reform. She went through the pain of division within the Carmelite order itself, between the calced and discalced. However, in the midst of all these tribulations, her spirit never broke. Teresa had discovered that when one suffers for love of Christ and for the salvation of souls, that suffering loses its bitter sting and transforms into spiritual joy. The lesson that St. Teresa leaves us with her life during the Reform is deeply comforting. Suffering is inevitable in this life, but melancholy is optional. We can't avoid the trials, illnesses, and contradictions and pains that are part of human existence, but we can choose how to respond to them. If we face them alone, with our own strength, and without giving them a transcendent meaning, they will crush us and fill us with bitterness. But if, like Teresa, we learn to unite them to the passion of Christ, to offer them as a sacrifice of love, and to trust that God brings good even from the greatest adversities, then suffering itself transforms into a path of sanctification and a paradoxical source of inner peace. Teresian joy didn't consist in the absence of suffering, but in the ability to traverse suffering with the heart supported by the love of God. Chapter 8. Friendship with Christ, Source of Consolation. The heart of Teresian spirituality is summarized in one word: friendship. For Saint Teresa, the Christian life isn't primarily the fulfillment of rules or the practice of abstract virtues, but a personal relationship of friendship with Christ. This revolutionary understanding completely transformed her way of understanding prayer and spiritual life. Teresa constantly insisted that Jesus isn't a distant master or a severe judge, but a close, accessible friend who desires our good more than we ourselves do. This friendship with Christ was for her the inexhaustible source of consolation in all tribulations and the foundation of her indestructible joy. Saint Teresa cultivated this friendship with Christ through constant meditation on his most holy humanity. Contrary to some spiritual currents of her time that despised the humanity of Christ in order to concentrate only on his divinity, Teresa always maintained that the humanity of Jesus is the sure path to reach God. She meditated on the mysteries of the life of Christ, his birth in Bethlehem, his childhood in Nazareth, his public life preaching and healing, but especially his passion and death on the cross. For Teresa, contemplating Christ in his passion wasn't a morbid exercise, but the way to understand to what extent he loved us. Seeing the divine friend suffering for us ignited in her heart a corresponding love that dispelled all melancholy. Saint Teresa's relationship with Jesus had the spontaneity and trust of a true friendship. She spoke to him in prayer with complete naturalness, sharing her joys and sorrows, her doubts and hopes, even her complaints. She didn't use elaborate formulas or artificial language, but conversed with him as one would with their most intimate friend. This simplicity in dealing with Christ is one of Saint Teresa's most liberating teachings. Many people stay away from prayer because they think they need elaborate words or heightened feelings. Saint Teresa teaches us that it is enough to present ourselves before Christ as we are, with sincerity and trust, knowing that he knows us and loves us just as we are. Saint Teresa received extraordinary mystical graces from Christ that manifested the depth of this friendship. She experienced the transverberation of the heart, where an angel pierced her heart with a dart of divine love, leaving her wounded with love for God. She had visions of Christ in his glorified humanity, intimate conversations with him, where she received instructions for her foundations and comfort in her afflictions. She heard the voice of the Lord saying to her, "Do not be afraid, daughter, for I am, and I will not abandon you. Do not fear." These mystical experiences were not an end in themselves for Saint Teresa, but confirmations of the loving presence of Christ in her life. What mattered was not the extraordinary nature of the graces, but the transformation of the heart in love. Saint Teresa's teaching on friendship with Christ is the most powerful remedy against the melancholy and loneliness of the soul. Whoever cultivates an authentic friendship with Jesus is never truly alone, because they carry with them the company of the best of friends. This divine friend is not only present in moments of consolation, but especially in the dark hours when all seems lost. Christ is the friend who does not betray, who does not abandon in adversity, who understands our weaknesses without judging us, who encourages us in our efforts, and who forgives our falls again and again. Saint Teresa's joy sprang from this profound certainty, knowing herself unconditionally loved by Christ, and this joy, founded on the love of God, is indestructible because it does not depend on external circumstances, but on a personal relationship with Him who is eternal. Saint Teresa invites us all to discover this friendship, assuring us that Christ anxiously waits for us to draw near to him, that he never rejects those who seek him sincerely. Chapter 9. The detachment that liberates Saint Teresa understood with crystal clarity a truth that is very difficult to accept. We cannot achieve true freedom and joy while our heart is tied to created things. This teaching on detachment is perhaps one of the most challenging of her spiritual doctrine, but also one of the most necessary for anyone who wishes to overcome melancholy. Saint Teresa observed that people constantly torment themselves over things that do not deserve so much anxiety. Material possessions, the opinion of others, comforts, disordered affections, health, future plans. These attachments keep the soul in perpetual anxiety because we live with the constant fear of losing what we have become attached to. Teresian detachment does not mean despising created things or living in stoic apathy. On the contrary, Saint Teresa loved people intensely, appreciated the beauty of creation, and enjoyed the honest goods of life. But she had learned to love all things in God and for God, not as ends in themselves, but as gifts from the Creator. This perspective completely changed her relationship with the world. She could enjoy the good without becoming attached, and she could lose without despairing when something was taken from her. She did not collapse into melancholy because her heart was not grounded in what she lost, but in God, who remains forever. This inner freedom was the source of her imperturbable peace. Saint Teresa identified the disordered attachment to honor and the good opinion of others as one of the most dangerous attachments. In her time, honor was a supreme social value, especially in Spanish society. However, Saint Teresa taught that worrying excessively about what others think of us is a slavery that robs the peace of the soul. She herself was the object of all kinds of gossip, slander, and criticism during her life, especially during the Carmelite reform. But she had reached such a degree of detachment from worldly honor that these criticisms did not disturb her inner peace. Her only concern was to please God, and this freedom from human opinion allowed her to act with boldness and creativity. Another attachment that Saint Teresa considered particularly harmful was the excessive care of health and bodily comforts. This does not mean that she preached recklessness or neglect of the body, but that she warned against making physical well-being the center of existence. Saint Teresa herself suffered illnesses throughout her life, but she did not allow this to paralyze her or plunge her into self-pity. She taught her nuns that a little voluntary mortification of the body frees the spirit and helps one not to be aware of every small physical discomfort. She observed with humor that many imaginary illnesses disappeared when the soul was occupied with important things. This attitude towards physical suffering is very liberating in an era like ours, so centered on comfort and the absence of all pain. The culmination of Teresian detachment is what she called the determined determination, not to want anything other than the will of God. This total surrender of one's own will to the divine will is the secret of perfect peace. When the soul reaches this point, it no longer worries about what happens because it fully trusts that God arranges all things for its good. Saint Teresa reached this degree of abandonment in the last years of her life, to the point of being able to say sincerely, "Lord, either suffer or die," and then later, "Lord, neither suffer nor die, but do your will." This supreme freedom, where even one renounces choosing between martyrdom or heaven, is the ripe fruit of detachment. And with this freedom comes a joy that nothing and no one can take away, because it is founded only on the love of God, who is eternal and immutable. Chapter 10. Joy in Service. Saint Teresa was a woman of tireless action. Her profound contemplative life did not turn her into a dreamer abstracted from the world, but into an indefatigable worker who until the last day of her life was occupied in serving God and souls. This combination of deep inner life with intense outer activity is characteristic of Teresian spirituality and contains a fundamental teaching about joy. Saint Teresa discovered that true contemplation doesn't separate you from your neighbor, but rather it propels you towards them with renewed love, and that generous service to others is an effective remedy against the sadness that comes from self-centeredness. and excessive worry about oneself. In her convents, Saint Teresa emphasized the importance of manual labor and community services as an integral part of religious life. She herself, being a prioress and founder, didn't exempt herself from the humblest tasks. They saw her sweeping, cooking, washing clothes, and caring for the sick sisters. For Teresa, these simple services were precious opportunities to love Christ in concrete people. She taught that there are no big or small jobs when they are done for the love of God, and that oftentimes God prefers humble services performed with charity over sublime prayers made with pride. This appreciation of daily work as a path to sanctification brought joy to tasks that others might consider monotonous or degrading. Saint Teresa had a special ability to create joyful communities. Testimonials from her contemporaries describe the Teresian convents as places where, despite the material poverty, the strict enclosure, and the penances, an atmosphere of joy and fraternity reigned. Teresa encouraged community recreation, where the sisters shared moments of honest joy, edifying conversations, music, and even small theatrical performances of religious themes. Mother Teresa knew that the devil flees from communities where there is true joy, because this joy is a sign of the presence of God. That's why she insisted that her daughters cultivate the virtue of kindness, avoid frowning and sad faces, and treat each other with genuine cordiality. The most important service that Saint Teresa performed was her work for the reform of the Church and the salvation of souls. She lived in difficult times when the Protestant Reformation had divided Christianity, and many souls were turning away from the Catholic faith. Teresa felt a deep pain for this situation and offered her life of prayer and sacrifice for the conversion of sinners and the sanctification of priests. This apostolic dimension of her contemplative life is fundamental. Teresa didn't lock herself in a convent to escape the world, but to fight for its salvation through prayer. This awareness of collaborating with the redemptive work of Christ filled all her mortifications and sufferings with meaning and joy. Saint Teresa's teaching on joy in service is especially relevant to combating sadness born of self-centeredness. Many people live immersed in melancholy because they are constantly focused on themselves, on their problems, their unacknowledged rights, their shortcomings, and frustrations. Teresa shows us the way out. Look outside ourselves, towards the needs of others, and towards the work of God in the world. When the soul forgets itself to serve, it paradoxically discovers that in that forgetting, it finds fulfillment. Generous service, especially to those most in need, has an extraordinary healing power. It takes the soul out of the vicious circle of self-pity and introduces it into the dynamic of love that is given. And in this giving of one's life for love, as Christ gave it, we discover the deepest and most authentic joy that a human being can experience on this earth. Chapter 11. The Testament of Joy. Saint Teresa's last years were of intense activity. Despite her increasingly deteriorating health, her body, punished by illnesses, mortifications, and exhausting travels, was gradually weakening. However, her spirit remained young, and her joy did not diminish. Those who knew her in these final years testified that, despite the constant physical suffering, Teresa maintained her good humor, her pleasant conversation, and her ability to encourage those around her. This joy in the midst of physical pain is one of the most eloquent testimonies that she had reached that deep peace that doesn't depend on external circumstances, but on union with God. In September of 1582, Saint Teresa embarked on her last journey. She was traveling from Burgos to Alba de Tormes to assist in the birth of the Duchess of Alba's child. Despite feeling gravely ill, she obeyed her provincial, who had ordered her to make the trip. During the journey, her condition worsened dramatically. She suffered internal bleeding, fevers, and intense pain. Upon arriving in Alba de Tormes on September 20th, she had to be carried in arms from the cart to the convent. That woman who had traveled Spain, founding convents with tireless energy, could now barely move. However, her first thought upon arriving was to thank God for having granted her a place to die within a Carmelite convent. During the last days of her earthly life, Saint Teresa showed an admirable spiritual lucidity. She requested the sacraments of confession, communion, and anointing of the sick with full awareness. Her last words were expressions of repentance for her sins and of thanksgiving for divine mercy. She repeated constantly, "After all, Lord, I am a daughter of the Church." This phrase summarizes her humility and her fidelity, despite all the persecutions she had suffered from some representatives of that same church. There was not a trace of bitterness in her, but only gratitude and love. On the afternoon of October 4th, 1582, the feast day of Saint Francis of Assisi, Teresa gave her soul to God. According to the testimonies, her face remained radiant and beautiful. Outwardly reflecting the inner beauty of her soul, Saint Teresa's death was actually her birth into eternal life. She herself had written in one of her most famous poems, "I live without living in myself, and I await such a high life that I die because I do not die." This longing for eternity didn't arise from a contempt for earthly life, but from an ardent desire to finally see face to face the one who had been the love of her life. For Teresa, her death was not a tragic end, but the happy fulfillment of all her aspirations. For years she had asked God either to suffer or to die, wishing either to continue serving in this life or to pass into the divine presence. In the end, God granted her the latter. The legacy that Saint Teresa left to the Church and the world is immense. Her writings continue to be read and meditated 5 centuries later, illuminating the spiritual path of millions of souls. The 17 convents she founded multiplied throughout the world, carrying her spirit of prayer and joy to the 5 continents. She was declared a Doctor of the Church in 1970, being the first woman to receive this title, along with Saint Catherine of Siena. But beyond these external recognitions, the true testament of Saint Teresa is her testimony that it's possible to achieve holiness, to overcome melancholy, and to live in profound joy. Even amidst the most adverse circumstances, her life demonstrates that friendship with Christ transforms everything, that prayer is truly the medicine for the soul, and that whoever seeks God with sincerity will find in him the answer to all the longings of the human heart. This is the message of hope that Saint Teresa continues proclaiming to all generations. Chapter 12. Prayer to Saint Teresa of Ávila, a prayer to overcome melancholy and attain true joy. O glorious Saint Teresa of Ávila, Doctor of the Church and teacher of spiritual life, you who knew the depths of sadness and discovered in God the source of indestructible joy, look with compassion upon my afflicted heart. Obtain for me from the Lord the grace to understand that true joy is not found in fleeting things, but in intimacy with Christ, the faithful friend, who never abandons and always consoles. Saint Teresa, you who overcame the spiritual mediocrity that robs the peace of the soul, help me to surrender totally to God without reservations or divisions of the heart. Teach me, dear Mother, the way of prayer, that friendly exchange with one who we know loves us. Grant me perseverance in the search for God, even though I may go through dryness and darkness, trusting that He never abandons the soul that seeks Him. Glorious Saint, you who discern the deceptions of the enemy, who uses sadness to turn us away from the Lord, help me to recognize and reject diabolical affliction, false humility, and the discouragement that paralyzes. Obtain for me the grace of holy detachment that frees the heart from the bonds that imprison it. May I not seek my happiness in honors, possessions, or in the opinion of others, but only in doing the will of God. Intercede for me before the throne of the Holy Trinity, so that, like you, I may find in prayer the interior castle where the King of Glory dwells. May I penetrate the mansions of my soul until I reach the center where God awaits me. Saint Teresa, woman of determined determination, give me strength to face the trials of life, with supernatural joy, uniting my sufferings to the cross of Christ and transforming them into offerings of love. Help me to cultivate the virtue of Christian joy, that holy good humor that dispels the darkness and makes present the joy of the Holy Spirit. May my face reflect the inner peace that springs from friendship with Jesus. Oh, Saint Teresa, who loved the Church so much, grant that I also may live for its sanctification, offering my prayers and sacrifices for the conversion of sinners and the perseverance of the righteous. Finally, dear Saint, when my last hour arrives, accompany me in the passage to eternity. May I be able to say with you, after all, Lord, I am a child of the Church, and may I deserve to contemplate face to face the one who was the love of your life and is my only hope of eternal happiness. Saint Teresa of Jesus, pray for us that we may attain the true joy that only God can give. Amen.